There we go.
Perfect. So I will just share this and let's have a look. Okay, perfect. So yeah, hi everyone. Thanks all for coming. I don't know how busy your week's been and how full of lectures, but hopefully I can share something new before the weekend. So just a few things to start. I'm Frankie. I'm a reporter at NewsQuest, and NewsQuest is the second largest publisher of regional and local news in the UK, and we publish in print and online. You might not recognise NewsQuest by its name, but the company has over 200 brands across the UK. So I work for the South London team. Our titles are the Croydon Guardian, the Surrey Comet, the Richmond Times, the Wandsworth Times, the Wimbledon Times, and News Shopper, which is our largest publication in the South East. When I started the job last year, I was assigned to a patch, which tends to happen in local reporting. And mine is Wandsworth, which lucky for me is where I live. But then a reporter left last year, so I also cover Richmond too. My remit covers Roehampton, so I'll be referencing some stories from the borough, which hopefully you might be aware of, maybe you've even reported on yourself. And it's probably also worth mentioning a bit about how I got my job, which I will do later on. It's actually with the Facebook reporter scheme. As I know, maybe some people go on the job hunt, and obviously it's a very tricky time. But I was in a very similar situation last year. I'd done a master's at City University in London. It was actually in international journalism, so kind of taking a step to the UK, to like UK reporting was maybe not what I'd intended, but it's been so fun and so interesting so far. Anyway, yeah, so that's enough about my background. I'm going to be speaking about local news in general, and I think why it's such an important structure in our society. So it would be much easier if we were together in person to ask you this, but I'm sure there's some probably button on Zoom where you can raise your hand. Maybe you can just raise it on your screen because I can see you. But who knows the name of their local newspaper? And who's read their local newspaper ever? And who's read their local newspaper in the last week? So just think about that to yourself. I've had, if I asked this question 20 years ago, I think the answer might be quite different. Our analytics tell us that readers are mostly aged 35 and up, and many are quite loyal and they've read the paper for years, but they do tend to be older, at least the ones that read the print newspapers, which we publish weekly. And I think the sad reality of this is because, well, especially now, local news and print is in decline. This is for a number of reasons, and I'll outline this throughout my talk. Ad revenue is a standout factor. And with this said, though, local news has never been more important, and there are signs that it may be entering a period of recovery. As you're all probably aware by now, the role of journalists is to keep the public informed and to hold power to account. But when reporting suffers on a micro level, societies as a whole lose important voices. Local news increases public trust and engagement by informing people in the day-to-day running of public institutions. When it declines, important stories go unreported and local democracy is threatened. It's taken a pandemic for many of us, especially in London, to realise the value of our communities. And in the last year, local news has been really useful in highlighting this cohesion. This isn't all conjecture. I'll be referencing mine and my colleagues' experiences, as well as some historic examples of stories throughout this talk to reinforce just how important local news is. So let's talk about its decline. As you can see, the statistics on the board paint a pretty bleak portrait of decline. An estimated 58% of the country has no daily or regional title. And in these so-called news deserts, people are increasingly turning towards London-based media and social networks to get their fix. We know this is a problem, as how is copious coverage of TfL relevant to someone who lives in a small town in Wales? And this is actually why the BBC has recently tried to relocate staff in newsrooms outside of London in order to democratise their content. They've relocated about 400 roles outside for various cities in the UK to make content more reflective as the UK as a whole. We also know the perils of relying too heavily on social media and user-generated content, and the myriad of problems with fake news and misinformation this creates, especially in today's climate where, for example, churning out false information about a vaccine could literally be the difference between life or death. As local news declines, it becomes increasingly centralised, as you can see by this map on the board. More than 80% of newspapers by circulation are owned by just 6 companies: Johnston Press, Tyndall Newspapers, Local World, Trinity Mirror Regionals, Archant, and my one, it's the big N, the green N, which is Gannett UK, or NewsQuest as we know it here. This has led to what some people call a democracy deficit, of reduced community engagement and a heightened distrust in public institutions. When readers don't have content that's relevant to them, they'll switch off or they'll go somewhere less reputable. So, as I said before, the big reason for this decline is lack of ad revenue. Before, papers would make money by advertising the back pages of the paper. So you might have seen adverts for local restaurants or listings for landscaping services. But advertising is increasingly moving online, with platforms such as Facebook and Google dominating the market. The format of local newspapers is testament to this, as many are frustratingly hard to navigate. Even I get exasperated when I'm looking on a sister site and it's just these kind of dodgy ads and paywalls and the adverts that follow you before I can even get to read an article. And as you can see by the infographic on the board, there's been about a 3.2 billion drop in 10 years, which is pretty severe. And also the figures from Press Gazette on the right are a little more recent, and they kind of mirror this decline. And it takes into account the pandemic, of course. But this isn't without pushback from publishers. I'm sure you're aware at the beginning of the year there was a big uproar between Australia and Facebook and Google because of a new law that could crack down on digital advertising and make these companies pay for their news. And elsewhere in the world, HD Media, which is a chain of about 7 newspapers in Virginia, have taken up a lawsuit against Google and Facebook. So here's where Facebook stepped in. To appease local news publishers, they basically pay the contracts of people like me to bolster the local news landscape by focusing particularly on community news to reach a compromise. It's a relatively new scheme where Facebook will invest around £230 million globally into local news. And as part of this fund, 4.5 million is going towards employing 83 journalists in the UK, and they work on small titles to preserve the character of local news. We work in newsrooms across the UK, but are trained with Facebook in conjunction with the NCTJ. We do biannual boot camps with Facebook, which are really handy for digital and social media journalism. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, these have been over Zoom, not in their fancy HQ in Fitzrovia. There's no obligation upon journalists to put their work on Facebook, though usually we do because it's good for our page views. But Facebook doesn't uprank our articles because we work for them above others in its newsfeed. So we've had the kind of bad news. And this is what happens when there is a significant decline in local news, or what can happen. Local news has traditionally devoted much space to covering the work of the machinery of governments. So, but with an increasing lack of resources and budget, it's harder to comprehensively cover everything that's going on. So council and court reporting has been hardest hit. There are rarely budgets to send local reporters to every court case or council meeting anymore. And although hyperlocal issues may not be the juiciest of material, they're really vital to cover. Reporting on the likes of planning committees or public scrutiny meetings acts as a window into infrastructure, which familiarises the public with the everyday workings of schools, hospitals, courts and politics. And this has been particularly relevant since 2010, when the UK entered a period of austerity and had to make a number of tough budget cuts. When the public can't see or engage in how the council manages their finances, which is of course paid for us, the taxpayers, it can lead to frustration and disillusionment. This is also the case in the coverage of a lead up to a local election. Newspapers are supposed to inform citizens about political issues, but lack of information can lead to disengagement, or what has been coined a democratic deficit. There's a great study called Journey to the Centre of a News Black Hole by Dr. Rachel Howell, which provides ample evidence for this, and which I've detailed on the slide. Dr. Howell's research in Port Talbot, Wales, followed the closure of the Port Talbot Guardian in 2009. She found a decline of almost 90% in reporting of local council, public and political and party meetings by journalists at the Port Talbot Guardian over the period of 1970 to 2013. In addition, the proportion of stories based on sources local to the Port Talbot area declined by about 20%. In extensive interviews with local people, Howell recorded that they felt frustration at their inability to influence decisions being made in institutions such as the local council and the Welsh Assembly. She discovered high levels of rumour and speculation in the town and found that ultimately voter turnout suffered. And this is a problem recurrent in the Welsh media, as a study by Cardiff University and YouGov shows. Here, 40% of the people of Wales incorrectly thought that Plaid Cymru were in government between 2011 and 2016, but it was actually Labour. Similarly, there were a really high portion of people that didn't know, just over 30%, which people argue might not have been the case if there were detailed local news reports. But there are solutions, and the BBC has a great local democracy reporter scheme where they pay the contracts of reporters to work on local titles. Our local democracy reporter is called Gronje, and she makes countless FOI requests. She trawls through budget documents and attends out-of-hours council meetings. I thought I'd let her describe her work. She does for London herself. So here's a clip from Gronje.
Hello, my name is Gronje and I'm a local democracy reporter. My role is funded by the BBC. The scheme was created after it became clear that very few reporters were going to council meetings anymore. Things like planning approvals for cladding material used in the Grenfell Tower were going through unnoticed. The BBC wanted to fill that gap and now funds more than 150 roles across the UK for local papers, so they can cover important decisions being made by councils that affect people's lives. Although I attend lots of council meetings, I can also cover anything related to the council. Less than upstanding developers trying to destroy woodland so they can build unaffordable housing, leaseholders shelling out thousands for cladding bills, and I've covered a group of women guarding 2 mature oak trees day and night for more than a week after Southwark Council tried to cut them down. They won and the trees are still there. One of my favourite things to work on this year was getting Lewisham Council to refund a disabled elderly couple for fines they should never have got, and I didn't even write a story on it. Sometimes the threat of bad press is just enough. It's really important to monitor the decisions councils are making at the moment, as they're strapped for cash and have to make cuts. I cover those cuts, and some really need to get covered because they will significantly and detrimentally affect people's lives. Lewisham Council recently cut the Children's Mental Health Service, but after some great local campaigning, the council promised to ring fence it in case there's a spike in cases. The local press can be invaluable when it comes to this. Councils don't like to look bad. The more people that know about these issues, the more people can voice their concerns. A lot of the time, very few people know about things like cuts because councils don't want to broadcast negative things. I found it from a short paragraph in a council document that it was housing families 2 hours out of the borough in a block labelled a human warehouse. It houses ex-offenders and has lots of issues with drugs and antisocial behaviour. No one knew the council was even doing it. I did a story and now they tell me they're planning to move the families out. That's why we're here, to inform people and mainly to help. It's very rewarding and not boring, I swear. I just love local journalism, being close to the ground and actually making a difference, albeit on a smaller scale. Good luck with your course and your careers. I think journalism is one of the best jobs in the world.
So that was a very positive response from Grania about wrongs being righted. Sadly, this is not always the case, and this is just one extreme example. But occasionally a lack of coverage can lead to more devastating consequences. And the lapse of the local press was particularly glaring after the Grenfell Tower tragedy in June 2017. In 1990, the nearest newspaper, the Kensington and Chelsea Chronicle, had 10 journalists covering the borough. But the paper closed in 2014, and after that, the area was covered by a single journalist working out of a newsroom based in Surrey. Precarious housing standards have been raised several times in council meetings, and tenants have been blogging for years about unchecked fire equipment and lack of maintenance of the building. But a lack of staff, which might have usually picked these cries for help up, meant warnings went largely unnoticed. Some journalists have even speculated since that the deaths of 71 people could have in fact been prevented if there were more reporters on the ground. I've quoted a Kensington News journalist who speaks candidly about how the disappearance of local news may have directly impacted Grenfell. And he says those people can do what they like because there's no journalists looking at what they're doing. That's why local journalism is so important. So this leads us on to our next point, that journalists are supposed to be the watchdogs of society who hold power to account. We've discussed local authorities, but there are many other structures of power in society, including corporations and emergency services, which means a large part of our day is sending inquiries or calling up press officers. I've heard our role be referred to as that of a scarecrow before. The very existence of journalists who might investigate and write about abuses of power acts as a threat that keeps the powerful in check. I actually had a story, one of my favourites a few weeks ago. A woman emailed me, she was from Singapore originally and she's moved to Putney. And she should have got her marriage visa, but usually it takes about 8 weeks to process. And she married a man from the UK and it took 5 months. And in that time, she was really stressed. Her mental health was suffering because she felt like she couldn't work without a visa. She just didn't know where she stood, just without this legal status, really, of being a resident. And all it took was just an email from me to the Home Office with her case number and saying that we were writing a story about the delay in marriage visas because of the pandemic. Within 24 hours, they had approved the visa. And I don't think I've ever had a kind of calls where I've had to brief someone where they're so happy and kind of crying on the phone. It was great. But the problem with this kind of journalism is it's more expensive and labour intensive. It requires a lot of time spent digging for sensitive information, and there's often legal costs involved, especially if it's a bigger investigation. There's also the risk that you'll sink time into an investigation but may not find anything worth reporting on. I know it's not a local example, but News UK once claimed that the Sun spent £73,000 on an investigation that was not published because it failed to meet the threshold of evidence needed for publication. And that's an outlet with a bigger budget, so you can imagine what it's like. I have had plenty of kind of juicy tips in the past, some feasible, some quite outlandish, but some of these I haven't been able to dig into because of time constraints. And I know I'm not the only journalist at the moment that's suffering with this problem, no matter the size of the organisation. But Orlando, our reporter covering Kingston and Croydon, is particularly passionate about holding power to account, and he's really involved in political reporting. So I've got a clip from him as well, which explains why this is a major motivation for becoming a journalist. So let's hear from Orlando.
Holding power to account might be regarded as a bit of a cliche by some, but it's a large part of my motivation as a local journalist, and I think it's an important part of the job we do. That's because diligent reporting can be one of the best tools we have to shine a light on injustices, abuses of power, and a lot of the structural imbalances and inequalities that we find in our society and the communities we cover. So to really talk about holding power to account, we need to recognise how power at the level we cover is diffused across various centres and institutions. So you've got like local government, the corporate private sector, state institutions like the police, and other institutions as well. So yeah, just moving on now. Obviously, we work quite closely with the emergency services in our job. Their communications officers provide us with fast information on breaking incidents on the ground. And the information they publish obviously is important and is very useful for us. We can use it. It's in the public domain. So that's how we can source some sort of breaking news stories. But it's really important to remember that institutions, for example, like the police, are also centres of power in society. Just like in all the previous examples I've mentioned so far, that can mean that there's often injustices, an unbalanced power relationship, and sort of abuses of power. One story that I covered in that regard recently was about the use of stop and search in Croydon. So basically, I basically delved into some statistics from the Met Police's data website, and it showed that Black people in Croydon were disproportionately targeted at a far higher rate than their white counterparts over a specific time period. Basically, this is an issue that the Met has been criticised, and police forces generally have been criticised for a lot in the past. And actually, an independent police report came out last year pointing out about 10 or 11 different changes that the police force could make in this regard to readdress the issue. But it seems, according to the state, or at least, that they haven't really gone far enough yet. The police have always sort of defended the use of stop and search, and they frequently tweet out things like showing how, for example, in some cases they've like managed to make a positive, what they call like a positive action, like an arrest, something like that, because of stop and search. But what they didn't mention, at least, unless you sort of ask them directly about it and really push them on it, is the fact that it's disproportionately impacting communities of colour and can have a negative impact on those communities as well. So in a case like this, it's really important to not just take the police's word for it, but actually delve into the sort of data behind their official line, pose some rigorous questions to them about what that data suggests, and then also get an alternative opinion as well. So in this case, we spoke with Liberty, the civil rights groups, who've been rigorous critics of stop and search, and make sure we included their alternative opinion about the practice alongside obviously the police lines that we got after our questioning on the issue.
So Orlando makes a really good point here, which is that you always have to keep a critical hat on. Often there'll be someone with an agenda, whether a press officer or a press relations team, trying to mitigate the effect or change the narrative of a story. So he's quite good at not being kind of fooled by this. So off the back of what Orlando said, I wanted to add this powerful international example of notorious American financier Jeffrey Epstein to show how local reporting can be a weapon against corruption. Epstein, a convicted sex offender who ran a sex ring of underage girls, was originally imprisoned in Florida in 2008, but he only spent 13 months in custody. Julie K. Brown, an investigative reporter from the Miami Herald, a regional newspaper in Florida, spoke to a local police officer who dropped hints that Epstein was still offending. The policeman said that he had tried to tip off journalists before, but felt that every time the story was hushed up due to Epstein's media connections. These were journalists at bigger news outlets. And he told Brown that if she continued digging, somebody would call her publisher and she would be assigned to the obituaries department of the paper. But Brown didn't give up. For 2 years, she interviewed women and girls that were part of a sex ring run by Epstein and accumulated tons of documents, statements from local police officers and the testimonies of 8 women willing to share their stories. These were published in a 3-part series in the Miami Herald called The Perversion of Justice, which is one of the most explosive news stories of the decade. Her work helped to identify some 80 alleged victims and helped reopen the investigation that saw Epstein jailed for the second and final time. Julie also said that her position as a local news journalist left her in good stead for making deeper and more trusting connections with sources. And on a really small scale, I've experienced this in the past, where forging bonds has yielded better stories. Around April time, there was a serious incident in Bushy Park where a violent dog mauled a young girl and her mother. The father of the family originally contacted our news desk, and I happened to be the one that picked up the email. However, by this point, the dad was quite shaken and he got cold feet about sharing his traumatic story, especially as police were still looking for suspects. After a week of checking in with him through calls and emails and building up a level of trust, he agreed to be interviewed for an anonymous story. But before this, I'd made him promise not to speak to any other media, so that by the time he felt willing to share his story, he came straight to me. When the story did come out, I was hounded by nationals, really, one in particular that I shan't name, asking for who my source was so they could do their own interview. But out of respect for his privacy, because he told me not to share his details, and he only really agreed to do the story because he could really see the kind of public interest value for other people's children and just to be more aware of dangerous dogs. I didn't share his email, which these said outlets weren't too happy about. As a side note, this will happen a lot as a local news journalist and it can be frustrating. But I want to reiterate that it's definitely not your obligation to share your sources. My rule of thumb is that if it's a national broadcaster and the story is about a charity or children doing something positive, then I usually would. So I've hooked up ITV with a young kind of, I think she was a 9-year-old girl writing a story about children's experience in the pandemic. And it was lovely to see her like the next day on ITV on the 6 p.m. news slot. But if it's tabloid wanting to sensationalise your story, it's probably not worth sharing for your sake and your sources. So we've had some bad news, and now it's time to talk about why local news is on the up in society. In March 2020, readership rocketed for many local and national news outlets. With so much breaking news and millions of people confined to their homes during lockdowns, people became more reliant on the media. Through local news organisations, many rediscovered their immediate surroundings. Some of the COVID restrictions were so localised that our websites were the only place issuing relevant information. For example, we updated readers about COVID testing centres, hospital admissions, or COVID cases in the borough. There was also far more community engagement in our human interest stories, perhaps because people were spending more time on social media, but also because there was a stronger sense of cohesion and camaraderie in the community. A lot more people wanted to support local businesses and cafes, for example. We covered the actions of mutual aid groups, establishing mask trees, or food banks for vulnerable people, and we profiled healthcare heroes and inspiring social enterprises. And this wasn't just in our newsroom. NewsQuest decided to turn its weekly paper in Oldham in Manchester into a daily, as the title saw record audience numbers online. And as local news interest grows, it also means we've got a lot more competitors, which is both good and bad. There's a new media outlet which has had a surprising genesis in the last couple of years. It was started by a former Goldman Sachs employer and who bankrolled the scheme and hired dozens of journalists in towns hit by newspaper closures, an attempt to fill this growing gap between local coverage and the people. There are also lots of Twitter accounts which circulate breaking news, and we work collaboratively with many of them. It just feels like a wider network has been created really over the pandemic. And I was originally disheartened that a lot of when I started this job, because I felt that there would be a lot of person-to-person interview, and I really thrive from that energy. But instead, they were really conducted over calls and over Zoom, which there are actually perks to this I've noticed kind of in the long term. You can fit so many more stories in. People are so much more accessible, especially people that might not have had the time to speak to you before because they would have been at work. And now that the country's slowly opening up again, I've had an influx of invites to community events, and I just started to realise you really can't attend everything, especially when your patches of Wandsworth and Richmond are two very big, bustling London patches. So the best person though to talk about kind of community spirit in the pandemic is Monica. She is our community reporter working in Wimbledon and Croydon. And she worked tirelessly since the onset of the pandemic to promote positive stories. I thought it would be useful to hear from her. She was in the thick of it before I joined. And she's produced some really inspiring features, especially covering the vaccine effort in the Wilson Centre in Wimbledon and at pop-up clinics in Mitcham. She's also an alumni of the University of Roehampton, and she regularly contributes to local radio shows. So here is a clip from Monica.
My name is Monica Charsley, and I'm the reporter for the Wimbledon Times and your local Guardian. And at the start of the pandemic, I was working for Shopper under the same company I am now, and that covers South East London. I work with Frankie, and I'm also a Roehampton graduate. So during my time, whether I was working in South East London to South West London, I saw the exact pandemic response. And what I noticed is that there was a complete shift in news. There was almost less news, which didn't stay. Crime did pick back up as though there was no pandemic. But what I did notice was the change in community, the pride that communities had. A lot of people said that their communities turned into more of a village feeling. People turned to support local businesses more. People were advertising to help them. And the first story I ever done was about an 11-year-old who was really upset about how the pandemic has affected certain people. He took it upon himself to ask his church if he can use their donation bins, and he started rallying food himself. He then printed off hundreds and hundreds of posters to help the community and let them know that he is there. And after this was just the first story I did, but then it just sprung. I picked up on a lot of volunteering stories, and the first half of the pandemic was definitely volunteering, fundraisers, helping the NHS. One which did stick out for me was Don's Local Action Group, which is set up by AFC Wimbledon and their fans. They are a football group in South West London, and they decided to direct their team efforts and spirits to helping others in need. Don's Local Action Group had been picked up nationally now by the Sun newspaper, by all the nationals, but we did focus on them from a very local angle from very early on. They did an amazing scheme which was called Stop the Digital Divide. They realised that there's some children who had to learn from home, but they didn't even have the basic equipment to do so. And they took it upon themselves to stop this, to get the equipment they need. And they showed that the government are maybe lacking or haven't done everything that they could have done or should have done and promised what they would have done. So that was a really big campaign which did make waves, and a lot of MPs supported this. And they also, delivered from, since the start, over 128,000 food parcels amongst other fundraisers to help. They then won a Sports for Social Change award, and they won that alongside Marcus Rashford. So it shows you that these small communities and these groups they've made such a big change that they are being recognised amongst the bigger names. So on top of this, I noticed a lot of community murals. I know that Frankie herself wrote one about a lady in Tooting who made one, which lifted everyone's spirits. It was little things. What can we do? We reported on community gardens. We reported on social distancing meetups. And at the beginning, there was neighbours, and they would do road parties completely from their doorstep, where they'd all dance, whether it was just cha-cha slide or the Macarena. So I definitely noticed more of a coming together vibe, which was really nice to report. It was nice news. I've then seen the shift to making PPE, which was a really, really big thing. And it was awful to watch, to know that our NHS workers were going without these vital equipment. Again, there was one community group based in South West London, launched by a mum from Morden, and they were called Acts of Random Kindness, and she just decided to sew all these masks herself and make blooming trees. All of a sudden, I looked around and there was masks with trees with sanitizer, and it became so popular that the hospitals requested these trees. So I've seen that a lot of people have directed their attention to social housing, and we've been able to report this more, highlight it more, and hopefully make a change within the communities in terms of how they should be living and basic living conditions. How I sourced my news became very different. I would put out call outs on Facebook. I wanted to hear from people who were behind the small businesses which had survived the pandemic. I looked for those who were self-employed, freelancers. I wanted to know how they were coping with the pandemic. I wanted to speak to the NHS workers, the frontline workers. I wanted to speak to people who had felt like they had been forgotten about, taken for granted, or were doing a real amazing thing but not being highlighted for it. So I definitely directed my efforts, and I did do a lot of features, a lot of call outs. It didn't all come from my inbox. So that was on me, asking people on Facebook, how have you been affected by the pandemic? And then that's when the stories came flooding in. A lot of people wanted to share their stories, but they just didn't know anyone would be interested. And that's what we were here to do.
So we've heard from all these inspiring journalists, but how about the future? Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, but there's a very comprehensive report called the Caring Cross Review.
My name is Monica.
And
my name is Monica Charsley, and
which is on the next slide. It was commissioned by the UK government and led by Dame Frances Cairncross, published in 2019. It looks into a sustainable future for public service journalism. The report made many recommendations, some of which I've outlined on the slide. And these include a significant tax relief for local newspapers, perhaps by registering some outlets with charitable status, or by establishing a direct government fund for public interest journalism. Despite the report's good intentions, many proposals will have fallen by the wayside just in the chaos of the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see how the future pans out. I can't comment much about the provisions in the government's pockets, but I am optimistic that the public will increasingly cooperate in local news. The popularity of neighbourhood apps, such as Nextdoor, which have exploded in the pandemic, is a goldmine of weird and wonderful stories. I check Nextdoor daily, and I probably recommend you too if you're reporting local stories. And it's just great to find out what's going on in a very limited radius. And there's surprisingly so much more to discover than just missing cats. Then there's also the emails in my inbox, which I get from what I like to call amateur sleuths, or certain members of the public that maybe have too much time over their hands through various lockdowns and has taken it upon themselves to make FOI requests and come up with these like elaborate investigative theories as to what they presume are really like shady goings on in the borough. But they're always interesting to read, and sometimes they do lead to an interesting story, and it's good just to have this engagement from people questioning our governments, questioning our structures and the way we are used to doing things. And finally, there's more of a culture of nominating people as just kind of shining lights in the community. The Pandemic Awards, or people get in touch with me to say, you know, there's this amazing person who lives near me, I think you should do a profile on them. So it's really inspiring to see this increased kind of response from the community, and I do hope this will carry on as we ever so tentatively return to normal. I've left probably quite a lot of time for questions, about 20 minutes, and just in case anyone has anything they want to ask either about my stories or anything I've said in this talk, or any advice I can give about jobs. But yeah, let me know if there is anything.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. Very inspiring. I really enjoyed that talk. So thank you. I think one of my questions was how can sort of local people contribute to sort of helping local news?
Yeah, I that's a really good question, and it's been a bit of a shame, I guess, for me, because I have had quite a few students who I would have been in that position, who have grown up around here and have seen all these really amazing stories going on, emailing me and asking, like, can I write something? Can I get a byline? And I think before I joined, there was a model where people could freelance or contribute stories and even kind of do some work experience in our newsrooms. But I think, like many places, because of COVID, that model has just been paused for the moment. But people can always message they can always email us or tag us on things on Twitter. And and suggest things for us to write about or flag things in the community. I think even just in terms of coming into the summer, there will be more of an opportunity to write as well. Obviously, I don't think like newspapers have the budgets that they used to, but we get columnists as well, which is quite a good way to enter. In Richmond, the RNLI, the Lifeguard Society, they write a monthly column, and also there's there was a kind of nature, like bird watching column. So there are lots of kind of, the nice thing about local news is it's very flexible, and it's underreported. So even just on your kind of day-to-day walk, I can be out on a weekend and see a poster up somewhere and think, oh, I'll just have to kind of make a note of that in my phone notes or something, and kind of follow that up on the week when I'm back at work. So I think that's the best way. I also know that Facebook are rehiring. They're starting a scheme again. I'm not sure where they're at with the process, but they're extending the Facebook reporter scheme. So it'd be really good to look at getting in touch with that. I think it's a really good place to kind of cut your teeth as a journalist. Lots of people say that local news is quite backbreaking, I guess, but it's quite hard work, but it's just really good hands-on experience that you might not get if you're at a really large organisation. You get kind of swallowed into the ranks. So yeah, that's what I suggest.
Great, thank you. And what would you suggest the best balance between getting work experience and getting the sort of right education would be in terms of like a journalism degree, and then how much like work experience would you suggest would be a good idea to start looking for, like internships or things like that? Are there many internship opportunities?
Yeah. So this is the exact struggle I had. I did an undergraduate degree in English literature in Edinburgh. And I did a year of that in America, and I'd done some work on American on the college newspapers. I think when I graduated, everyone thinks English or humanities degree is a perfect fit for a journalist. I think they're very wrong. I learned so much by doing a journalism master's in terms of my writing style. I think I think it can go two ways, and this was some of the advice I was given. I think it's obviously a big commitment to do a master's, and you have to spend the money and you take that year. And people say you can get that experience by starting just doing loads and loads of internships. But then on the other hand, not everyone can afford to live. And a lot of these internships are based in London. So a lot of people, you would have to have some kind of financial support if you're going to do unpaid internships, which at the moment don't always lead to somewhere. I know before, if you maybe did a 3-month, I was interning at a travel media company actually, before I took the local news job. And I told you I did international journalism. I'd also kind of been lining up a job in Sydney, Australia in travel media. I was hoping to fly out there. It was very exciting. And I was interning at this travel, they published in-flight magazines, and I loved working there. But again, internships don't always lead to being hired. Some people get very lucky. I know a few of my classmates from my master's degree have done internships and have got hired from that job. I think it's just, you've got to work out what's feasible in terms of your time and finances, and doing a master's degree can fast track a lot of years of internships, because you are taught, like, there's, at least in our masters, like there was a newsroom that was like simulated, and we produced a magazine and had these guest speakers. So I found it really, really valuable. The one thing I would say is just use every holiday at your masters, and I know you're coming to the end of yours, but just to do work experience just as much as you can. I did some work experience at the Eye, which is a London newspaper, which was really valuable. And then I went to do an internship in the Christmas at this travel media company that I was talking about. I stayed on 1 day a week and freelance with them into my master's. So that was from January until I was there in March, like 20th or something, when it was like the day the office closed because of the pandemic and everyone was freaking out. Like it's just good to kind of keep your options open, keep obviously your studying up, and then keep work experience up on the side. And I think it's a shame that a lot of, and I'm sure people will have said this before, but a lot of the media industry does tend to work on connections and networking. And it's getting less like that now, but even just meeting people that can be your mentors. I have some really amazing mentors that I've met, and who can just give you life advice. There's a really good network called Women in Journalism, which I'm assuming you've heard of, and you can join that, and they do really good events and good even online networking stuff at the moment. And it just might be the difference between, you know, applying, like when you're applying for those kind of dream internships or dream jobs, you might have met someone at one of these events who you managed to prove something to, or who liked your work ethic or your people skills. So yeah, that's another thing I'd suggest.
That's great, thank you. That's very useful, because I know, especially for a lot of students graduating, they're not very sure as to how to proceed or where to go. I feel like, you know, as time goes on, getting a job ends up being harder and harder to, you know, get that foot in the door.
Yeah, of course. And it was like when I graduated, I was really lucky because I found this job while I was doing my master's. So I had about, I think, a week in between. But I know for a lot of the people in my master's, it took quite a chunk of time, but then not to be disheartening, a lot of them freelance while they were looking, which was really cool. I think that's another thing that I would suggest doing. If straight away you can't find a job, just try and pitch your stories anywhere. I think if you have something interesting to say and you send out enough pitches, someone will commission it, and the budgets are getting stronger at the minute. A lot of people weren't commissioning at the beginning, but over the pandemic, but they definitely are now. And yeah, I think the friends I had from my masters it might take them a bit of time, but some have gotten on to really, really amazing things. We had quite a few that got CNN internships that have now like extended them. And I think you just have to think, like, you just got to stay motivated and keep, if you know. And also the nice thing about journalism is once you kind of got those skills, or you have a basis of what the skills are, it's quite transferable into things like you know, like comms, or being a PR, or copywriting, or even content writing or marketing. So it just adds another kind of string to your bow, and you, even if there's not it's very, very rare that your dream job will come available immediately. So even if it means you go into different things and you just upskill yourself, basically, I think journalism's a really good degree to have. And also, kind of because of the connections you will have made with your classmates, it's really useful then to go into the industry and then have all these other people like who you can chat to, and you know, you might find that you cross over and might need a favor or might need a source or something. So it's really it's a really good degree, and I'm sure it won't be like this kind of climate forever.
That's great, thank you. That's been very, very useful. I think we have one question in the chat from John. He says, "Excellent talk, wonderfully put together and presented. I enjoyed it thoroughly. How can we how do we differentiate between true local news and local news that takes more of a tabloid approach to journalism? And also, do you have any recommendations for the Bristol/South Gloucestershire area based newspapers?"
Yeah. So I will start by, well, thank you actually about the talk. And then, so in terms of the tabloidy aspect, this was something I was quite worried about when I was joining on a local news team. It does vary paper to paper, and I know some of our newspaper's competitors do take a more maybe like sensational approach. I've been lucky, my editor has a very clear like house style and will always, you know, be formal and err on the side of just being really cautious and neutral, which I think is good, because you do get a lot of pushback from a journalist. As a journalist, I've had it even before. I try and really stay kind of true to, you know, how the story is and not try and exaggerate, even when you see an opportunity which maybe others would run with. And I've had people then email me and say, like, why did you spin the story this way, or why did you make this your angle? And I think that's always going to happen. You've got to have a really thick skin as a local journalist, as any journalist, but as a local journalist, I didn't quite have that at the beginning, and I'd get really flustered every time someone complained, which is always going to happen because you're writing news, and there's always, you have to make it like accurate, you have to make it balanced, but someone's always going to be unhappy if they don't, if, you know, I've had a lot of stories about kind of planning permission and maybe sports clubs trying to kind of, or things opening on, for example, the common, which is common land, and people just don't like negative press, but things need to be reported. I think in terms of, again, just establishing, I think what you have to remember as well is that sadly, juicy stories sell. So you have to establish whether that's something you want to be a part of. I think Monica mentioned it in her video that I'd written a story on a mural in Tooting for the NHS. And like I said before, how some nationals can come in and kind of pick up on your stories and either use your sources to interview them, or if they can't find them, just rewrite it and kind of twist what you wrote and give it a different angle. And this happened with this mural story. This woman had painted this beautiful mural thanking the NHS outside her house, but it was a shared terraced house. And the council and the housing provider asked her to wash it off. It was only a chalk mural actually, so it wasn't painted. So it's a chalk mural. They asked her to wash it away. And she'd been doing it every day in the first lockdown as kind of therapeutically. And she'd incorporated a lot of her neighbours into the mural. So there were some of her neighbours were partaking in Ramadan, so that she had drawn some Ramadan symbols on the mural, and there were some kids doing video games, and she'd put a Game Boy on or something. And they asked her to wash it away. I wrote about that and kind of about her, like, she had appealed to ask for it to stay on a little longer, and it got quite a good community response, so I wrote about that. And then a tabloid that I won't name came in and kind of just made it really, really, I'd already got a statement from the housing provider, and they just made it so kind of anti the housing provider. And then obviously I got a lot of pushback, so I'd written the story originally. But yeah, I think you just got to realize that's what's going to happen, and if you're not the one doing it, then you can still kind of be true to yourself. I'm not sure I would be able to work somewhere that I knew I had to kind of churn out lots of kind of like really hot take type articles. So yeah, that's what I say about that one. And then just about Bristol, I don't know much about. I know that Bristol Live, there's someone in my Facebook group who she's just gone on, it's a 2-year scheme, and I got in touch with her when I started the Facebook group, the Facebook scheme, because I saw she was in one of our talks, and she was really present on social media. And she's now left, and she's done her 2 years, and she's gone on to go and be an assistant producer at Radio 4. But she worked for the Bristol Live, and she said she couldn't recommend it highly enough. So with the Facebook scheme, it's not just News Quest, they put you Reach. Actually, Bristol Live, I think it's Reach. It's like Archant, lots of different newsrooms they'll put you in. But she said that working at Bristol Live was great. And I think Bristol's such an exciting city that I think there is a real, like, strong community spirit there. I couldn't say for sure because I haven't worked there, but almost maybe more so than London, because the one problem with local news in London is that because London's such a big city, there's not, like, there's so many pockets of areas and people, it's harder to kind of to get that real, like, neighbourhood pride kind of feeling. And I think there is a really strong sense of that in Bristol, and probably Bath as well. And almost when you have a smaller area, it's a bit easier to kind of feel like you can really get involved and cover things. Two of my, also part of my Facebook cohort, one works for the Oxford Mail and one works for the Brighton Argus. And some of the things they do are really, really cool. I saw the one who works at the Brighton Argus did a story with Fat Boy Slim in FNAF for National Fish and Chip Day. And it's like the kind of thing that just like those quirky kind of stories that sometimes get overlooked in London because it's just so vast. So actually, if you're truly looking at local news, it might be better to go off and really start not in London and in somewhere like a smaller area where there is where people rely a lot more on their local news, because here there's the Evening Standard, there's the Metro, there's My London. It's a saturated market. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I think that was a very, very thorough, like good presentation. I very much enjoyed it, and I think it gave quite a good bit of insight for both the situation with local news and for like students looking to get into local news and to journalism as a whole. So thank you very much.
And if anyone has other questions to think of, like feel free to DM me or anything, or if there's any stories they see and we do get a chance to kind of get people freelancing, then ask again in a few months and I might be able to help. So yeah.
Absolutely. Is it all right if I pass on your email then in that case too?
Of course.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Alrighty.